Hi everyone, my name is Meredith Phillips and I chose to do this project on the USDA's Good Agricultural Practices, Good Handling Practices Audit Program. And why is this important to small and medium-sized farms in Washington State, and what resources are available to them should they decide to implement this program? For the rest of this presentation, I will refer to the Good Agricultural Practices, Good Handling Practices Audit Program as GAP or GHP. I chose this topic because at first look I found this fairly confusing, and for a while I thought the GAP GHP audit was actually part of the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA, and I wanted to learn more about this because I am absolutely not familiar with any sort of agricultural practices, especially when it comes to small farms and what's required to them in order to do business with retailers. Although this is not a federal or state requirement, the GAP GHP audit program is in line with preparation for compliance with the produce safety rules associated with the FSMA. GAP GHP practices are specific to produce. Many small farms in the state of Washington, due to their size or income, are not required to comply with the FSMA, but there are plenty of other reasons why farms should be interested in this. The GAP GHP best practices and successful completion of an audit are completely voluntary, but there are some implied incentives that go along with owning a farm that produces fruits and vegetables grown, harvested, and packed in accordance with GAP and GHP audit standards. So how do small farms benefit in participating from this audit? Well, in Washington State, large retailers, schools, and other institutions like hospitals do require a successful GAP audit by either the USDA or another third party in order to do business with them, regardless of the size of the farm. In other words, the farm can create better business opportunities and relationships while ensuring their land, produce, and workers are safe. So some background into the FDA's Food Safety Modernization Act. It is legislation that was signed into law in 2011. It was the first food safety law that focused on the prevention of contaminated food rather than the response to it already being into the nation's food supply. The law has been implemented on farms by farm staff in a phased approach over the last few years, and implementation time for compliance was based on criteria like revenue thresholds. The state of Washington, although home to Seattle, which is the fastest growing city in the United States, is home to over 37,000 farms, so most of the state is actually quite rural. Many of these are small local farms who sell directly to the consumer at farmers markets or roadside stands. Other small farms have partnerships with schools or larger retailers. Nearly 2/3 of farms operating in Washington provide the primary income for that farm owner. To put the importance of protecting the crops and farm workers into a context that relates to safety and health, Washington is actually the lead producer of a number of goods that are exported outside the state, including apples, pears, and hops. So if there were cause for a recall, many people could be sickened. Because farms do business with retailers and in an effort to protect their workers in the community, even the smaller farms have decided to implement GAP GHP practices and participate in an audit. The farm-to-table movement has really taken hold out here as well. So many restaurants and other retailers are choosing to buy from smaller local farms rather than ones that may be larger and further away. So what is the GAP GHP audit program? GAP GHP are documented best farm practices as set forth by the USDA in a number of areas, including the implementation of a food safety plan and standard operating procedures, including a 24/7 emergency contact number for the farm. Traceability and recall. So do they have a recall plan, and are they able to get the food back? Worker health and hygiene. So things like hand washing, separate eating areas from the farm, no animals on the fields, and adequate restroom facilities. Livestock and animal practices, should the farm be diversified. Other areas included in the audit program are water usage, irrigation, drainage, sewage treatment, harvesting procedures, packing facilities, and the storage and transportation of the produce. So what does the typical audit look like? Well, first of all, a farm must request the audit. As stated before, they are not mandatory. Out here in Washington, we have 2 Washington State Department of Agricultural offices that offer these audits. And there's one in Yakima, Washington, and one in Wenatchee, Washington. And these towns are both located in the rural part of the state. The request for an audit must be received no later than 2 weeks before the end of the growing and harvesting season, so that the auditors can see the plan in action and observe operations. All farms seeking an audit must have a written food safety plan and standard operating procedures. A good food safety plan has a number of critical parts, including an accurate map and a detailed description of the farm's operations and practices. Perhaps the most important aspect of the plan is that it can be successfully implemented on that particular farm. Some portions of the audit are mandatory for any farm requesting the audit, while other parts may not be applicable to that particular farm. Audits can be buyer-driven, so farms do have to complete the sections required by their buyers. An audit in Washington can take between 2 to 8 hours to complete, depending on the size of the farm. And out here, the rates are $75 per hour per auditor. USDA trained and certified GAP GHP staff from the Washington State Department of Agriculture Fruit and Vegetable Inspection Program perform the audit for the farms out here in Washington. The required parts for all farms are general questions, which include the food safety plan and the overall farm review. Field harvest and packing procedure audits are usually done, but not all the time. Other parts of the audit that may be required are house packing facilities, storage and transportation, wholesale distribution and terminal markets, and preventative food security procedures. Here are 2 excerpts of what an audit could look like. The top graphic is a few questions from the general questions, and the bottom graphic shows a small portion of the farm review section. These 2 parts are just a small fraction of the entire itemized checklist. All parts included, the checklist is just about 30 pages long. So as you can see, this is a thorough, comprehensive audit of the farm, and it analyzes all aspects of produce safety. Each part of the audit is assigned a point value with a passing score of 80% of total possible points. Here is the verification score sheet from the audit. So you can see the sections have different point values or totals associated with them. Small farms are often family-owned small businesses and may not have the resources or knowledge of how to participate in the seemingly overwhelming process of best practice implementation and audit certification. So what resources are available to small farms in order to successfully implement these best practices and to ensure that they pass this audit? So one program specific to Washington is called Bridging the Gaps. The initial program began in 2011. This is a comprehensive education and outreach program administered by the Washington State Department of Agriculture, but it's actually funded through a USDA specialty crop grant. The project team coordinated education programs for both the auditors and for the farming community. For the auditors who were not familiar with the smaller size or diversified farms, they provided hands-on tools and resources to help them understand the challenges that these smaller farms are faced with. They also worked with the farming community to provide examples of best practices of how to implement the GAP GHP on their farms that will meet the audit standards. What worked for large single crop farms would not be the same model used for these smaller farms. The original launch of the Bridging the Gap program included on-farm workshops for both auditors and growers, expansion to auditor training, the development of the Bridging the Gap Farm Guide, which is targeted to the small farms, a launch of a user-friendly application that takes producers through the process of scheduling an audit, and participation in nationwide food safety discussions. And they also provide advocacy for Washington growers. This is a great website, and it's full of all sorts of resources, including FAQs, contact information, videos, and a number of guides available for print or download. The On-Farm Food Safety Project is another online tool. It's not specific to Washington, and this is funded by large corporations like Cisco and Earthbound Organic. The site offers a step-by-step guide to an introduction to food safety and a number of resources like videos, templates, and how-to guides to create a food safety plan for a small farm. The On-Farm Food Safety Project provides plan review as well. There are a number of other guides available online through universities and state departments of agriculture. The USDA GAP GHP audit checklist is also available online. Here are some key takeaways from the GAP GHP program administered in Washington State. GAP GHP program is not required for many farms, but can benefit the farms by doing so because many buyers or retailers require a successful audit to conduct business with them. The FSMA and GAP GHP are not the same regulation, but implementing GAP GHP and passing an audit can better prepare a farm of any size should they need to comply with the produce safety requirements associated with the FSMA. The FSMA is administered by the FDA, while the GAP GHP program is facilitated by the USDA. There are robust programs that are funded by private business and state institutions to help smaller farms implement the GAP GHP audit program on their farm. In other classes I've taken for the Master of Public Health program, we would end each presentation with a discussion question to kind of help facilitate the discussion process. So if you are so inclined, what types of resources are available in your state to facilitate a successful GAP GHP audit program on a small farm?